It is time for our class on the Gospel of Matthew. We're just reading it and talking about it. It's been our practice, seems to be working pretty well. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms. Happy Mother's Day if you're here, if you're in the fellowship room. Happy Mother's Day if you're online, wherever you are. We want you to have a great day. Not just a great day, a great life. But this day we sort of focus on that. That's good. Matthew chapter 16 is where we are, and I need 4 readers. I need somebody for chapter 16 of Matthew, verses 1 through 7. 1 through 7. Anybody? All right, PJ. PJ's back. Harold, I'll give you 8 through 14. Matthew 16. Matthew 16, 1 through 7. And then Harold's got Matthew 16, 8 to 14. Who will take 15 to 20? I saw Johnny's pointing to somebody. All right. Is that Steve? And then Rich. Is that right? All right. I'm going to shift my glasses around so I can see who's who back there. Steve, you'll have 15 to 20, and Rich, you'll have 21 to 28. You'll finish out the chapter for us. All right. Thank you for volunteering. And let's read Matthew 16 together.
Pharisees and Sadducees came up and testing Jesus. They asked him to show them a sign from heaven. But he replied to them, "When it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, there will be a storm today, for the sky is red and threatening. Do you know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times? An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and the sign will not be given it except the sign of Jonah." And he left them and went away. And the disciples came to the other side of the sea, but they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, "Watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They began to discuss this among themselves, saying, "He said that because we did not bring any bread."
But Jesus, aware of this, said, "You men of little faith, why do you discuss among yourselves because there is no bread? Do you not understand or remember the 5 loaves and the 5,000, and how many large baskets were taken up? Or the 7 loaves and the 4,000, and how many baskets were taken up? How is it that you do not understand what I do not speak to you concerning bread? But beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees." Then they understood that he was not saying beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he began asking his disciples, saying, "Who do the people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, some said John the Baptist, some Eli, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.
Pick it up at 15.
He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on the rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ.
From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then we will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom.
Very good. Thank you all. Just a point of interest. We read that chapter out loud together, and it took right at 4 minutes. So if you think about taking 4 to 5 minutes out of your day, you can read a chapter of Scripture, and you can read it out loud, which takes a little more time than reading it silently. But it's I can't tell you what a great practice it is just to do that. And it doesn't have to be once a day. How many times do we take 4 minutes to sit and wait for the commercials to be over? Any more, 4 minutes is a short commercial. So, all right. Verse 1, the Pharisees and Sadducees, there they are again. How many times have we seen them so far in Matthew's gospel? Now, I'm not asking because we've pointed out or I've pointed out how many times they've confronted Jesus, but just to bring our attention to the fact that they have. Do you remember any times previous to this when they've done this? They've come to Jesus with some kind of a question, trying to catch him, trying to contradict him, trying to criticize. This is the 7th time. The 7th time in Matthew's gospel, the Sadducees and Pharisees are coming to Jesus with contradictions. What are they asking for? Asking for a sign. Now, I didn't hear the rest of that comment. Ah, okay. Because he hasn't done anything at all so far, right? Nothing he's said, nothing he's done has indicated that he's any different than anybody else whatsoever in their minds. Because when your mind is already set to go one direction and you're not willing to allow it to go a different one, that's their problem. Now, I read this and I think about how horrible they are, but I wonder how many times I've had my mind set in a certain direction and not wanted to change it, even after I saw, that's really true. So there's a built-in lesson for Marty Kessler right there. And here's our dilemma. We don't want to be wishy-washy. We don't want to be one of those people who, no matter what they hear, the next thing they hear is which direction they're going to start thinking. You need to have something solid, something firmly set that you know is true, and you hold on to that, but be willing to listen to something that you maybe haven't considered before in case you've missed some aspect of truth that you need to be picking up on. This is what we do when we study our Bibles. We have an idea set that we think this is the way this happened, and somebody else comes, well, have you thought about this? Well, think about it. Just because it's new and you haven't thought about it before doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but give it some thought. But that's not where these guys were. That's where we need to be, but that's not where these guys were. What do you think of Jesus' reply? Bud?
I think that sometimes we miss the mark in the fact that in our day and time, we see as much activity, religiously speaking, as they did then, because there was always disputes. It was always he said, she said, they said, or they wrote. There were people who had already been on the spot calling themselves Christ.
Right.
So how's he any different? See, they're saying, well, what's the difference? And like you said, you have to have something reliable that you know is true and stick to it. And with us, that's the scriptures. And so even today, we still have disputes discussions about what's the truth? What's this biblical
Right.
truth? And
Exactly.
we have a lot of people talking about they have the power to heal, they have the power to do this, they have the power to do that. And it's always been that way.
And probably always will.
Something reliable that you can hang your hat on and say, look, this is not, everything that has been said has been truthful.
Right. Who previously questioned whether or not Jesus was the Christ, but not in a contradictory, critical way? John did. John had been imprisoned, and he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, okay, are you the guy? You remember Jesus' answer? This is chapter 11. Go back and read. It's not cheating to go back and look at what we've already crossed. John sends his disciples to ask Jesus, chapter 11 of Matthew, verse 3, are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else? And Jesus answered and said to him, go report to John what? What you see and what you hear. Those two things. Now think about Jesus' response with regard to chapter 16, when the Pharisees and Sadducees are saying, show us a sign. And back in chapter 11, Jesus has already said, just look at what you see and listen to what you're hearing. Those are the signs that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus didn't tell John's disciples, go back and tell him, yes, I'm the guy. He said, you look at these signs, you look at these indications. And the indications were, verse 5, the blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. Those were indications that Jesus was the Messiah, along with how many other things? Signs of the times Jesus is talking to these Pharisees about. What were some other signs that these guys could have looked to and said, okay, that fulfills what we've been taught about the Messiah? What tribe was he from? Tribe of Judah. That's where the Messiah would come from. What family was he of? Family of David. That was the proper family. Where was he born? Just like Micah had said, in Bethlehem. Did he have someone preceding him, preparing the way, just like the prophet Malachi had said, and Isaiah? John the Baptist. These and so many other things were already abundant signs that Jesus was who he said, but these guys, no, they're not satisfied. So, yes?
They're adulterous, in fact, fulfilling the traditions of men and not obeying what God said.
Right. They're faithful to someone other than God, or something other than God, and that constitutes spiritual adultery. Now, I'm glad that these days have passed, that there are no other people around who don't want to listen to reason, who don't want to hear logic. Yeah, you see where I'm going with this. Our politicals, it's like nobody's listening. Nobody's listening. And you can reason with people about whatever, but they already have the direction they want to go, and it doesn't matter about logic and reason in the minds of a lot of folks. Now, don't lose hope. Look around in this room, and what do you see? You see people who care about God. You see people who care about logic and reason and seeing truth and responding to truth. And that's why you are here. In a little while, we'll have even more people here. And then there will be people back here again tonight and through the week. People are listening to the gospel. They're listening to what God has to say in this world. Not everybody is like a scribe and a Pharisee. There are those. But do you remember that time that Jesus said, I'm just tired of all this. I'm going to quit. He didn't quit until he said, it is finished. And he didn't quit then. He was just done. It was over. He had accomplished what he came to do. Those weren't his dying words. Those weren't his last words. What were his last words? Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And he said it with what kind of a voice? A loud voice. Said it with a loud voice, not some whimpering little last bit of strength voice. But Jesus was strong to the end, and then he willingly, willfully, voluntarily offered up his life after 6 hours on the cross. So he never quit. And there's a lesson for us right there. It's interesting how he answers. I think it's interesting. When it's evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky's red. When in the morning, you say there's going to be a storm today, for the sky's red and threatening. What do we say? How do we put that? We like the Navy, so we say, red sky at night, sailor's delight. Red sky in the morning, sailor take warning. And that's what Jesus is talking about. You've got these signs down pat. But you can't discern the signs of the times. The signs of the times are what we were just talking about. All the indications that Jesus was the Messiah, aside from his claim to be the Messiah. And Jesus says, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign will not be given it except the sign of Jonah, which is 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the whale. So they leave this place, they leave this discussion for the time being, and they get to the other side of the sea, and what do the disciples discover? Man, we forgot to bring any bread. Should have swung by a drive-through on the way out of town. Jesus said, watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Did they understand what he was talking about? Not at this point. And it's interesting to me that God said, let's put this in the gospel so people can read about this. So people can read that Jesus said something and his apostles didn't pick up on it. And I'm so glad he put those things in here, because there's so many times I read and I don't pick up on it. So I'm not any weirder than the apostles were. They didn't get everything right off the bat, and so do we fail sometimes to get understanding. They began to discuss among themselves, it says in verse 7, he said that because we didn't bring any bread. Were they right? No. You ever come to a wrong conclusion about something God has said? Hang in there. Don't give up hope. Keep reading. Just talking to the teenagers in the Wednesday night class, one of the things we talked about was the fact that it has been said, and I think it's been proven true time and time again. The Bible is its own best commentary. In other words, if you're reading something at one point in the scriptures and you don't quite get it, you don't quite understand it, there's another place somewhere else that'll make similar commentary, and you can put it all together, and it's really beautiful how it works like that. This is a living document. This is the Word of God. It's not like any other book or volume of books that's ever been written, and it plays into itself. It's like a living organism. Verse 8, this is of interest to me as well. Jesus, aware that they had missed the point of what he said, what did he say to them? You men of little brains, little faith, little faith. Now, why didn't he say you're not quite smart enough? Because this didn't have anything to do with being smart. He's addressing a lack of faith on their part. You didn't see what I'm talking about. In other words, this is what I think it means, and I might be missing the point too, but you have to look at it for yourselves and see, does Marty make sense? Is that right? Or is he missing it just like the apostles did? When Jesus speaks, he's very, very seldom speaking about simply the things of this world. When he speaks, he's given us some insight into the things of the heavenly realm. And so if that's our thought process when he speaks, we're going to be ready to do our best to decode in a way, to decipher, to interpret, to understand. All right, he's not saying things that we would be locked into down here on earth. He's saying things that are of the heavenly realm. How can I figure out what he's saying that's of the heavenly realm? He can't be talking about regular old bread, because that's not Jesus. He's way above that. But their faith was what he brought in question, and I wonder if that's the reason, because they were still looking at things on the earth. I have a habit, I guess I picked it up as a kid. When I walk, I tend to walk with my head down, looking at the ground in front of me, and I like to tell people, I do that because I'm really thoughtful. I don't have a clue if that's why I do that. I just do that. And sometime years and years ago, some guy said, "Hey, Marty, get your head up." And, oh, okay, and then I tripped and fell. So, no, I didn't really, but that's kind of how these guys were. Their heads were bent down looking at the things of the earth when Jesus talks about bread, and Jesus is talking about so much more than the bread of the earth. What was he talking about? Teaching. The teaching of the scribes and Pharisees. Watch out for that, guys. Watch out for what they teach. Watch out for their influence. Because it's not just their teachings, it's that you might even be influenced to think, well, I don't want to be on the outs with the scribes and Pharisees. I don't even agree with their teachings. That's the situation. I've had people tell me, well, I don't really agree with what they say, but I want to be in that group. And they don't always say that in so many words, but you know that's where they are, that's what they're thinking. And Jesus is saying, you beware of their teaching, that influence. What object lesson does Jesus use to get their minds off bread? There you go. Don't you guys remember? In other words, didn't you learn anything from that? There were 5,000 men plus all the other folks who were there, and we fed them with 5 loaves and a few fish, and there was plenty left over. Didn't that raise your horizon just a little bit? Didn't that set your sights a little higher than just the bread of this world? Jesus would say later when people were following him, well, you're following me because you got fed. And that was never the point of Jesus coming. He never came simply to feed people the bread of this world. He came to feed us the bread of life. And that's what he's constantly doing. And we are tempted all the time to be preoccupied with the things of this world. Or, verse 10, the 7 loaves and the 4,000. Oh, 2 object lessons. Wow. How many large baskets full did you pick up? Rhetorical question. So how is it that you do not understand that I did not speak to you concerning bread? But beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Now, if I was there, I probably would have been going, well, you didn't explain that to us. It's like Jesus is saying, you need to start seeing this stuff without waiting around for me to explain things. You know who I am. You know where I came from. You know where I'm going. If you've been listening to anything I've been saying, you know what my business is. It's my Father's business. It's not my business, and it's not even the business of this world. This is the business of heaven. Get your sights set a little higher. Get your eyes lifted up. Get your heart lifted up. Get your spirit lifted up to see the things that I'm trying to say to you. Then, verse 12, then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of the bread, but the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. All right, now they're in Caesarea Philippi, in verse 13. What question does he ask the apostles? Okay. Did Jesus know the question's answer? Sure, he knew what the answer was. He knew what people were saying about him. Why did he ask the apostles? It's time for them to learn something. That's why we ask our children things. Say, now, if you take 2 apples and you put them with 2 other apples, how many apples do you have? You better know the answer to that. But you ask that to your children to try to get your children, oh, you have 4 apples. And that's what Jesus is doing here. What were their answers? Who was the first one? John the Baptist. Who's next? Elijah. By the way, in whose spirit did John come? In the spirit of Elijah. Now, the people who had seen John had never seen Elijah, but they knew something of his spirit. They had read, apparently, and knew what Elijah was like. And so John comes in his spirit. And it's interesting to me that from what God inspired to be written about Elijah, these people saw that same spirit through the writings of God in John. And so they say, well, Jesus, he's John the Baptist, or he's Elijah. Who else? Jeremiah, prophet of old. Who else? Some other prophet. That's what people were saying. All of these really, even though they're not particularly accurate, these are accolades. Wow, he's like John the Baptist. He's Elijah. Jeremiah, one of the prophets. What's Jesus' next question? Who do you say that I am? And who answered? Of course, it was Peter. And his answer was, you are the Christ. What does Christ mean? The anointed one of God. That's what Christ means, the anointed one. Now think about it. Who did people say he was? John or Elijah or Jeremiah? Which one of those answers is right? None of them. The people were wrong. When we get our information from the masses, beware. What do people say is popular right now? How do people say we should dress? How do people say we should talk? What do people say we should watch on TV? Whenever I get online in one way or another and somebody says, oh, this is a must watch, it's something in my mind says, I ain't going to watch that. If you say that's a must watch, I'm not going to watch that because I'm just rebellious. That's just the way I am. It's just, I don't want to be guided by that. Jesus doesn't want us to be guided by this world. So he asks, who do men say that I am? And you get all those answers, and they're all wrong. How does Peter know who Jesus is? Jesus tells him, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. What does Jesus mean by that? How did the Father reveal this to Peter? Jesus doesn't get specific on that, does he? Remember in Acts chapter 16, Peter is in the city of Philippi. Paul, and he's talking about Jesus, talking about the gospel. Who was listening? It's Philippi. It's Acts 16. It was Lydia. Lydia was listening. She was open, and the Spirit of God inspired Luke to write that God opened her heart. Now, I wonder if that's what God has done for Peter in this situation. Not put that information in Peter's mind, but just open Peter's mind, his eyes, the eyes of his mind to see that truth. It's interesting that Jesus says, my Father revealed this to you. Now he says this in verse 18. You're Peter. What's the translation of Peter's name? Petros means a small stone. I think Jesus was making a play on words here in the Greek language. You're Peter, you're Petros, you're a small stone. Then he says, upon this rock. And the word rock is the Greek word petra, which is a large stone. You're a small stone, but upon this large stone, Jesus says, I'm going to build my church. And the gates of death will not overpower it. What was the large rock? What was the petra upon which Jesus would build his church? The fact that he was the Son of God. That's the rock. That's the foundation stone upon which Jesus would build his church. Later on, when Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus, he would write in chapter 2 that the church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Jesus Christ being what? The chief cornerstone. In other words, every other stone is measured and set and placed based on the cornerstone. That was the purpose of a cornerstone in those days. You wanted to get your building straight, you cut a cornerstone straight and you put it in place, and everything else came off that cornerstone. That was how everything else was measured. And that's what is happening here. Peter, small stone, on this large stone, the fact that I'm the Christ, I'm going to build my church, and death will not overpower. It says the gates of Hades. Is there a difference between Hades and hell? There is. Hades is the realm of the dead, the place of the dead. I think what Jesus was saying here is death is not going to overpower this. Did Jesus die? He did die. He died on the cross. And this, to me, is his clue to them, his hint to them, his encouragement that would be later encouragement to them. Death is not going to keep this from happening. I'm going to die. As a matter of fact, the only way it could happen is if Jesus would die. And that's what he would say, that's what he would allude to in the Lord's Supper when he says, this cup is the new covenant in what? In my blood, shed for many for the remission of sins. Now when he says in verse 19, I will give you, Peter, the keys of the kingdom, the Greek word for you in this context is singular. So he is saying this to Peter. But when you get over to chapter 18 and verse 18, it's a context of talking about discipline among God's disciples. The same idea of binding and loosing is there in chapter 18, verse 18. But in that context, it's plural. Whatever you, plural, bind on earth, you all, as it would be said in the South. Whatever y'all bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever y'all loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. You all have the keys of the kingdom. He's talking to the apostles. When did they use those keys to open the kingdom? Pentecost. The day of Pentecost, the kingdom was open. Peter stood up to preach, but he wasn't the only one preaching. As the people began to respond to the word that was being said and to the wonders that were being done, the apostles spoke, and they spoke in all of the languages represented in Luke chapter 2. The Holy Spirit had Luke enumerate 15 of those. And they were speaking in those languages so fluently that people were wondering and saying, aren't these a bunch of Galilean fishermen? Well, yeah, they were. But when the Holy Spirit's at work, it doesn't matter where you come from. It's going to be good. It's going to be right. All right. Verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and raised up on the third day. If you want, you can mark this. This is the first time that Jesus very clearly tells his apostles, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and this is what's going to happen to me. I'm going to die. This is coming. He told them very clearly. And what Matthew's recording here is that from that time, not at this one time, but from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that this was all going to happen. And it's all about him being crucified and raising up on the third day. What was Peter's response? His response was natural. He's still back with the bread. Oh, he said that because we didn't bring any bread. Peter, get your eyes up off the ground. I'm the Son of God. You just said, I'm the Son of God, just a few verses prior to this. And I told you that God's the one who revealed that to you. And now I'm telling you this is going to happen. And it's a hard truth. It's not a pleasant truth. It's a hard truth. You don't want to believe it. Now you're like the scribes and Pharisees. You've got this idea in mind that you don't want to be changed. And so when I tell you what the truth is going to be according to God's plan, you say, oh, this is never going to happen because I'm Peter and I don't want that. Now think back. In time, all the great deeds of God's people, when they overcame odds in so many different ways, how many of those folks would have ever chosen to be in that situation? I know I've talked before about David. What did David do twice? Two things he did before he ever got to Goliath. He killed a lion and he killed a bear because both these animals were coming out to kill his sheep. And I'm just certain that David did not wake up either one of those mornings and say, man, I hope a lion comes after the sheep today. That'd be great if I had to fight a lion. Probably never wanted that. Probably never wanted the bear. He didn't go to the valley of Elah where the armies were opposed to each other, hoping, man, I hope we get to fight a giant today. That was the farthest thing from his mind. And then all of a sudden there was a situation. He said, well, here it is, and I'm the man. How come you guys are letting them do this? And he stepped up to the plate. I really don't think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wanted to be thrown into that fiery furnace. What did they do to get out of it? They didn't do anything to get out of it. They trusted God, and God got them out of it. They didn't try to, well, what can we tell the authorities? Can we cave a little bit? Can we compromise a little bit? God doesn't want us to die in that fire. Well, they didn't know that. What did they say? Even if we die, they said, as one. And it's interesting, there wasn't one of them going, hey, wait a minute, boys. Don't include me in that. No, they were all three. Even if we die, we're not going to do what you say because we know that's wrong. So here's Peter. He doesn't want to hear what he's hearing. How many times have you read the Bible? And the problem wasn't that you didn't understand what it was saying. The problem was that you understood what it was saying, but you didn't want to do that. Yeah, I understand. So what does Jesus say to Peter? Get behind me, Satan. Why does he call him Satan? Right now, Peter is wanting the same thing that Satan wants. He wants to thwart this plan. He doesn't want this plan to be fulfilled. Peter didn't know that. I don't think he had any consciousness that he was really going against God, but what he was failing to do was open himself up to what God had planned. Now that's a lesson for me, because as things happen today and tomorrow and this week, they won't all be pleasant. And Marty Kessler has to be willing to say, you know what? If God is allowing this, he's here with me while it's happening. It's not pleasant, it's not fun, but instead of kicking the ground and cussing and getting upset and losing my faith, I need to go along with this. That's what Peter needed to do. Peter should have said, wow, oh, Lord, that's tough, but if that's your plan, I'm your man. But that's not what Peter did. And Jesus had to straighten him out. And this is when Jesus says in verse 24, if anyone wishes to come and follow me, he's got to do what? deny himself, and take up what? Take up his cross. I'm just told you that I'm going to be crucified. You need to be willing to be crucified. And if it was me there, I'd have been going, oh, no, I'm not in this to be crucified. I'm in this to bring back power to Israel. Crucifixion's not on my horizon. I don't have that in my sights. And Jesus says, I'm not talking about letting the Romans nail you to a tree. That's what they're going to do to me. But once again, Jesus is higher than the ways things are done in this world. That's how people are crucified in this world. They're nailed or tied to a cross. But when Jesus talks about us being crucified, he's not talking about that. He's talking about us dying to ourselves. And you are your own worst enemy. And so if you are willing to die to yourself, not me, I'm pretty good for myself, but if you will die to yourselves, you'll be better people. Not me, no. Isn't that the way we think of it? This is always for somebody else. Let somebody else die to themselves. I've got a pretty good plan. My way's pretty good. Jesus says, whoever wishes to save his life, what's going to happen? You're going to lose it. Whatever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. I remember my brother-in-law was a lineman for AT&T way back in the day when you'd see guys with these stakes on their boots climbing up telephone poles to go all the way to the top and work on the wires up there. Had this big honking leather belt that they'd throw around the pole and climb up that thing. And he said, if you ever start to slip, you know what you have to do? You have to lean back on that belt. What do you think is the most unlikely natural response when you're on a telephone pole and you start to slip? The last thing you want to do is push away from it. He said what you typically do instinctively is grab the pole, and he said that is the absolute worst thing you can do because you're going to slide down that pole. Have you ever seen telephone poles? It's like they just make them with splinter machines. He said that's miserable. And it's the same way here. We have to set our sights higher and be willing to do what God calls us to do, even though in this world's thinking, that's the last thing we would do. Especially as Americans. We're independent, we're free. I don't want to die. I want to live. And Jesus says, if you want to live, you got to come to me. And when you come to me, I'm going to tell you to die to yourself. And that's the only way you can live. There is no other way to live the life that is full and truly free other than dying to yourself. Then he asks the question, what's it going to profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Now, it's easier to see what he's talking about the older you get. Because through life, you accumulate all these things, and there's so many of those things that you thought to yourself, man, if I could only have that, I'd be happy. If I could just get my hands on that, once I'm able to afford that, life is going to be good, won't need anything else, and we're still accumulating stuff. We're still going down to Bass Pro. We're still going to Walmart. We're still going to Lowe's, and we're going by just slobbering. Oh, man, oh, that's beautiful. If I could just have that. I got a good one, but that's better than the one I got. And it's always going to be like that. And eventually you start to realize, you know what? All this stuff I thought would be fulfilling, I'm still looking for something to fulfill me in the way of this world, and I'm not going to find it. So it gets easier as you get older if you're paying attention. What Jesus is saying here is absolutely true. You gain the whole world, still forfeit your soul, what do you got? You got nothing. You got worse than nothing. For, he says, this is why that's true. The Son of Man, he's going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels. Then he's going to repay every man according to his deeds. Uh-oh. If my deeds are that I've only sought the things of this world, I'm going to get paid for that, and it's not going to be good. But if I have sought first the kingdom, things will be okay. And then he says this, where we'll pick up on this next week, Lord willing. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. You won't die until you see this happen, some of you. And that's the cliffhanger. We'll leave it here and pick it back up next week. Thank you so much.